So this is a bit of an unusual video for me. It's not a product review, it's not a how-to. I'm not really sure what to call it, but um, I have in my home theater at home. It's not your usual setup. It's a living room sized room with a huge screen that occupies one whole wall or more, almost a whole wall, and then a large projector that projects on it, and that's how I watch my movies and so on. And it's got two Magnepan speakers on either side of the screen that are close to 6 feet tall, and those take a lot of juice to run. I have a Rotel amplifier that I bought probably around 1986 or something. That was the least expensive amplifier I could find that had enough power to drive the Magnepans. And I've got great use out of it. It's a great amplifier, but uh, like so many things at the front end of it, the knobs, the volume control, the selector switches for inputs have gone through 2 or 3 cycles of trying to rejuvenate them, and they've gotten to the point where they're just hopeless. I can't keep them working well, and various channels will cut in and out, or the left channel will be half the volume or quiet compared to the right channel, and vice versa. I just can't milk that anymore, but the power amp is needed to drive the Maggies. And so I was looking around for an outboard stereo preamplifier. Those things used to be common. Now they seem to be like hen's teeth, just scarce. And when you find them, they're usually incredibly expensive. I found a number of them that are into several thousands of dollars. I just can't believe how much they cost. And I didn't need to get one with a DAC in it or anything like that. I just wanted a good old-fashioned stereo preamplifier. And it would be nice if it had a remote control, because the old Rotel, that's one thing it was missing, and it was hard to change the volume on it or the input selections. So I was looking for a basic stereo preamp without a lot of bells and whistles, but with a remote control. And I wasn't finding one, and I called Crutchfield, and they were very helpful and said, well, they did have one product. It's made by a company out of California called Parasound. It's part of their Z series of preamps, and it's the third model in that series. So they call it the Zpre3, and it seemed to be exactly what I was looking for, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. Regrettably, Crutchfield was out of stock and said they were back ordered on this product, probably for months. And they said, well, we're sad we can't sell it to you. And I said, well, I want to buy it from you. You help me find a good unit. But I'm going to have to look elsewhere. I need to get on this. I can't wait some indeterminate amount of time. And so they wished me well, and I found Amazon still had a seller that had like 5 of them left. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter where you look, whether it was Crutchfield or Amazon or any other place I looked. If anybody had stock on these, they were typically about $550, which seems like a real kick in the teeth price-wise until you think about. I recently went through a Best Buy and looked in their stereo system. Even some things like 30 watt per channel, undistinguished looking stereo integrated amplifiers were like $8,000-9,000, or $800 or $900 rather, or over 1,000. I couldn't believe it. I used to be able to buy those things for a couple $100. How times have changed. Anyway, so I popped for it, made it my Christmas present to myself. It's my justification. At any rate, I'm pretty pleased with the build quality. It seems very sturdy, well made, uh, like a professional piece of gear in terms of build quality. It's not all plasticky. The front panels, aluminum, not plastic, made to look like metal, like so many things are now. So, pretty pleased with that. I looked and found a tag on the bottom that says it's made in Taiwan. That's a decent mark. It's not made in the States, although I wondered at the price they're asking, maybe it was. So I opened it up just to see what was in it. I didn't expect it to be full of stuff. I think the cabinet's made as large as it is, so it doesn't just slide around on whatever you set it on. It has to be big enough to have some weight and some mass, some friction with the surface it's resting on. And that I think is good design, good thinking. It has several circuit boards that are interconnected, as you can see in this group of pictures. There's 2 or 3 boards for the front panel, and one large board for the back panel with an auxiliary board, like a daughter board riding up on it. And then there's also a separate power supply board that appears to be the only power supply. I'm not trying to make my narration here match up with the pictures at all, just letting you look around inside to see how it's built. But again, it doesn't look cheap at all. It looks like serious high quality audio equipment. Let's take a look at the front panel. So on the left is a power switch. This is just like a membrane switch or something. I mean, the button physically moves, but it doesn't move very much. It's obviously operating a little tiny tactile switch on a circuit board. It's not actually switching the AC power. Although I should note that on here, an AC power cord does plug directly into it. It does not use a wall wart, so that's another mark of seriousness and quality. But the power is always on to it as long as it's plugged in, and the power button just turns on most of it, but it doesn't switch the AC power. And I mentioned that it does have an AC power cord, and it uses a normal IEC connector like, computers and other things use. So next to the power button, I should also mention that the power button is surrounded by a ring LED, which is either red or green depending if it's on or off. And obviously if it's not even plugged in, then you don't get any color illumination. Next to that is a 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter stereo phone plug or stereo phone jack for headphones. And if you plug those in there, the volume, there's not a separate volume control for the headphones. It just follows the main volume control. And then there's an aux connector, also a stereo phone jack of the 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter size. That is connected in conjunction with one of the RCA line inputs on the back, so it's sort of doing double duty. If you plug something into this aux jack on the front, it disconnects the associated line input, so you can actually have 2 different sources plugged in to that one input channel, and the front panel jack takes priority. But if you do plug something in the front aux jack, then it gets an extra amplifier stage. I think it adds about 12 dB compared to the line level. To the right of the power button and those jacks is a LCD display, 2 lines of alphanumeric characters with a backlight. It's a green backlight. You cannot control the contrast nor the backlight intensity. It just is what it is. I think that it seems like the contrast is not very well adjusted, because at least on mine I saw quite a lot of background illumination instead of just the characters. I plan to send a communique to Parasound's tech support to see if there's anything I can do about that, because I think it could look better. Maybe there's a hidden setting that I'm not aware of. Anyway, to the right of that is another button, just like the power button. It's just a decorative button over an internal tactile switch on a circuit board, and it's surrounded with a ring LED. The LED is off. If you're not muting, but if you push the button, you can toggle muting on and off, and then it turns on red or green, I forget which. When you're muting, I think it turns on red. Then finally, the multi-purpose button that's labeled as a volume knob. It's really a combination or multi-purpose knob and a push button. Like so many things use a similar combination knob and button these days. So if you just turn it, it adjusts the volume. But if you push it in once, it just clicks. And then the knob instead changes which input you're listening to, so you can cycle through the total of 5 different inputs that this can accommodate, 4 regular ones and a one that's called bypass for basically chaining these things together. This or other things can be chained with it, and that's what the bypass input's for. And then if you push the knob again, then it becomes a treble control where you can adjust the treble up and down. Push it again, then it's bass. Maybe it's bass, then treble, I don't remember. And then you push it again, and it becomes a balance control, so you can adjust left and right. You push it again, and it returns to volume. Or if you just don't do anything with it for a few seconds, it returns to volume on its own. Let's go around the rear panel and look at the connectors there. So you can see that there's a group of inputs. Everything on here is done by line level RCA connections, and there's no preamplification in here. It always assumes that you have line level or better. Now you can attenuate and boost, but it's not like you can plug in phono inputs or anything here. There's no gain for that type of thing. And then there's a set of 6 connectors, also RCA line level, sort of in the middle of the rear panel, and those are for the various types of outputs. Again, they're all line level, but there's a set of fixed, unvolume controlled stereo line level outputs, and a set of variable, in other words, volume, tone, balance controlled stereo line level outputs. And then there's a couple of special purpose ones for example, synthesizing an output to drive a subwoofer. And then off on the right are some remote control type connectors. Taking a closer look at the inputs, there are 4 channels of input, numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4, with the 4 being the one that does double duty with the aux jack on the front panel. So both the number 4 RCA line level and the front panel aux input with its 12 dB extra gain share the same input selection when you're selecting between the inputs. There's only 5 selectable inputs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and bypass. And bypass, like I said before, is for chaining in additional sources which themselves probably have selections. It could be the output of another preamplifier or another one of these or a number of things. And the bypass is called bypass because it bypasses the volume and tone and balance adjustments that affect channels or inputs 1 through 4. It just allows you to select that instead of the 1 through 4 normal inputs, and still it just basically passes around the preamplifier part of this and goes straight back out the outputs. Okay, the remote control, or just control as it says here, there are 2 1/8-inch monaural or tip and sleeve type. Like I think I already said that they're the 1/8 inch size or 3.5 millimeter phone style. But again, they're not the stereo kind, they're the monaural kind with just the tip and the sleeve. Anyway, the one that's marked 12 volt out, that is to interface with certain power amplifiers which have provisions for a 12 volt trigger signal. So whenever this preamp is turned on, it outputs 12 volts at that jack, and you connect that up to a trigger input that's intended for a 12 volt signal. And so if you turn this guy on, it would tell the power amplifier to turn on as well. If you turn this guy off, the 12 volts goes away, and that tells the power amplifier to turn off. So it's a way of tying them both together if the power amplifier is so equipped for a 12 volt trigger signal. And then the IR in is, they go in at some pains in the manual to mention that the infrared remote control on here is designed to have a pretty wide field of view, and you could operate it pretty well from anywhere in the room. But maybe you have this closed up in a cabinet in entertainment system or something. And then there's all these external infrared receivers that you can put up and then connect to various equipment. And that's what the IR in jack is for. That allows you to have an outboard IR sensor to use instead of the one that's built into the front of this unit. And then finally you have the RS-232, and that's a bidirectional jack intended to work with a number of home automations and control systems. And the manual mentions Creston, AMX, Control4, Savant, and Elon as some of the things that would use RS-232 for interconnecting all sorts of things to this unit. Keypads, touchscreen panels throughout the house, and all sorts of things. And there's a protocol available. It's not in the user manual, but it's available for download from the Parasound website, and so that's what that connector's for. So here's the part of the video where I'm going to talk about the riser I made for my Zpre3. And this is because I have a stack of equipment in my home theater that includes a CD player, an old DAT player, or DAT deck, and the power amp. And this unit being smaller than any of those, I can't put this on the bottom. It needs to be on the top. And also, I had arranged it so the power amplifier, the Rotel, is at the top of the stack because it gets pretty warm on top, and it can't really be blocked by any other equipment. So the DAT deck is on the bottom, and then the CD player, and then the power amplifier. And I realized I was going to have something to allow me to put this Zpre3 up on top of the power amp, but without blocking half the air vents on the top, which would basically be all the convection cooling for one channel's worth of heat sinks. And that's a fairly powerful amplifier, so it can generate a lot of heat. So I just decided to do this using whatever I had laying around, but make it look pretty decent. And I started off with a piece of scrap 2x4, as you can see in this picture, and then I was cutting it down into a couple of equal-sized pieces. Here I've got the two pieces made out of that scrap of 2x4, and also a front and back panel to keep those spaced properly. And those are just made out of some 1/8-inch thick craft plywood scraps that I had laying around. And then I have them arranged here just for verification of their dimensions. And then I'm using my strap clamp like I'd use for assembling picture frames. I'm using that to hold all the pieces tight together while the wood glue dries. Here's how it looked after the glue dried, but the job is far from done. This actually makes a delightful little place for warm air to accumulate underneath the Zpre3, which is the opposite of what I want to have happen. So I've got it elevated now so that there can be air escaping, but I need to give it a way to escape. And so I decided to make a whole bunch of ventilation channels using multiple passes on my table saw. Okay, here you can see how I've made 2 rows of vents. Again, I just made multiple passes over the table saw blade and then flipped it over and made a bunch of similar cuts on the opposite side. So there's a lot of open space here. And you can also see 4 places where I used a Forstner bit to make shallow recesses. These are positioned to go under the bottoms of the feet of the Zpre3 so that it locks into place on top of this and won't slide around. But I wasn't happy yet with the amount of ways for warm air to escape this, so I decided to perforate the rear connecting strip with 5 sizable holes punched through there with a Forstner bit. I didn't want to have holes in the front, but I figured now 3 out of 4 sides have lots of openings in them for warm air to escape. And here are a couple of coats of black spray paint that I shot it with. And I think it came out looking pretty good. I didn't go to any great effort to, sand this within an inch of its life and do primers and resand it and all that stuff. It's a little bit on the quick and dirty, or as Dave Jones would say, how you doing, but it's in a kind of a dark area of the room, and it's going to be covered up by another piece of stuff, so it didn't need to be a pristine finish, but it still looked pretty decent. I cut out a couple of pieces of red felt, and here they are after being cut out. I also cut some pieces of stiff, I think it's about a 1/16 of an inch thick steel wire. This actually came from one of those flags like utility companies jam into the ground to mark pipes and things. It's very stiff wire. And I cut that out to make alignment pins. And here are the 4 felt pads held on with rubber cement, contact cement. And then here are a couple of shots of those alignment pins stuck into some epoxy and holes drilled into the wood. Those pins are designed to go into the air vent slits on the top of the Rotel amplifier to keep this whole thing from sliding around on top of the amp. And then, of course, like I already said, the Zpre3 won't slide around on top of this because its own feet sit into the recesses on the top of this. Okay, returning to the installation, I've got the output of my preamplifier I have next to my movie watching chair for remote volume control of that. The output of that preamp goes into the input number 1, and then the CD player goes into input 2, and the DAT player goes into 3, and then I just have a stereo RCA cable going into 4/aux that just lays on the floor in case I want to bring some equipment up and connect it temporarily to this amp. And I can use that same channel as already mentioned by plugging in things like a handheld MP3 player, or some of my handheld digital recorders can be plugged into either this cable on input 4 or into the aux jack on the front. So a lot of ways to get signals into this. Over towards the right you can see a thick black stereo cable going in to the fixed output, which is pre-volume control, pre-tone and balance control. It's just right off of the selected inputs. So that's the fixed output, and that cable goes to a headphone amplifier I have, so I can listen to whatever is selected but use the volume control on that device instead of this device to control the headphone listening level. I have a separate video on that one, on making that preamp, in case you want to watch it. And then the variable output, the one that is influenced by this preamp's volume, tone, and balance controls, is the set of connectors farthest to the right there. And those just go down a couple of feet and plug into the input to the power amp stage of the Rotel. There used to be a set of jumpers going into those, which went from a set of preamp output RCA sockets or plugs, so that nominally the preamp output of the Rotel would go right back into the power amplifier input. But I've removed those jumpers now, and now the Rotel's preamp section is not used at all, and just the power amp is being driven off the variable output of this unit. Here's how it looks sitting on top of the riser, on top of the Rotel, on top of all the other things. And here's another view of the same thing. I deliberately made the riser smaller than the preamp, so it would look less monolithic. And there's a side view of it powered up. Here's a label I made up in my Brother P-Touch label maker to just make it official that the Rotel's preamp is bypassed and replaced with this unit. And then I have the channel assignments marked on the second line of this label, so I don't forget which one is which. Here's just a quick view of the power button and how it's lit up around in red when it's off and green when it's turned on. And then the light around the mute button is just off when it's not muted, or red when it is muted. So here's the remote control that came with mine. This is the ZP3A. It's the newer version of the old one, the ZP3, that the manual shows in it. It essentially has dedicated buttons for everything that on the front panel of the preamp require multiple operations, like pushing the volume button once or twice or 3 or 4 times and then turning it. So you can select the inputs with dedicated buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, and bypass on the remote control. There's separate on and off power buttons that duplicate the push on, push off of the power button on the front. There are separate up and down buttons for volume, up and down for treble, up and down for bass, and left and right for balance. So you can just push those directly instead of having to go through multiple steps to change things. And there's also a dedicated mute button on here. There's a special button that causes all the buttons on this remote control to light up. That's a nice touch. You're sitting in a dark home theater or somewhere, you can just mash that button and see the buttons more easily. There are also additional buttons on here relating to volume memory. This preamp has the ability to memorize 1 or more volume settings, and you can set it up so you can memorize it and then jump back to that even if you've changed the volume to something else. I think it's just a favorite turn-on volume where every time you turn it on, or turn the power on, it returns to the same favored turn-on volume from which you can then set it to something else. And for that, you just adjust the volume to the one you want to memorize and push the set button on the remote control, and then push the power on button. So you're telling it this is the volume I want it to be when I turn it on. And you can also cancel that feature easily enough, and then you can memorize a favorite volume separately by adjusting the volume to what you want it to be, pushing the set button, then pushing the dedicated mem or memory button on the remote control. So it has that functionality. And there's also a button on here called dim, which I had missed before, but that turns out to be the answer to the question I was going to pose to Parasound earlier, that there there's not an adjustable contrast to the display on the front panel, but there are two different preset brightness levels. And so the dim button can be used to cycle between the brighter and the dimmer backlighting. Another thing you can do here is, by default, the display shows a numerical input selection, inputs 1, 2, 3, 4, and then bypass. But you can, as shown in these pictures, change the numerical part to a more descriptive name selected from a library of something on the order of 25 different choices. You cannot specify your own, but there are quite a few choices. There was not one for DAT tape, so I just had to put in tape. That was the closest I could come. But also here you can see the bypass, and when you have bypass, I should have mentioned that when you turn the unit off, it automatically goes to bypass. And that's because I think there's some means in here with even the preamplifier turned off, the bypass input automatically gets routed through to the output. So then you could just pass a signal through it without this even being turned on. Here's another look at the things you can adjust. The volume is always displayed as a number between 0 and 100, 100 being the loudest and 0 being nothing. I currently have it set to 80 in this example, so it's not depicted as a bar graph in the case of volume, just a number. And then you can switch up and change bass. Bass is the first one you come to after volume. This is what it looks like when it's null, and then you can bump it up from there to progressively higher numbers. It also gives you a numerical value such as +6, or you can crank it down to the left of null. Here I've got it set to -7, and then you can do the same kind of thing for treble, or you know, pan left or right from center. In this case it says L equals R, meaning that the left and right are the same level. I realize that most of the pictures I've taken were with the camera up very close to the display, and it kind of got washed out. This picture is taken from a different, well, a greater distance, and this is more what it looks like to the naked eye. You can see just a little bit of ghosting behind the letters that are illuminated by the backlight. But then if you use the remote control switch's dim setting to lower the brightness, this is more the way it looks, so you get essentially no ghosting in the back. But in a brighter room with more illumination, you'd want it to be on the bright setting, and then you don't really notice the ghosting. So again, it is effective, and in my case, I like it better in the dim mode. Okay, the only video section of this entire presentation. So I ran this with some fairly loud organ music through my Maggies. So I was making the Rotel work pretty hard. And you know, it gets pretty warm up here, but it's not like you can make toast on it or anything. I just lifted the bottom, or I lifted the preamp up and felt on the bottom, and you know, it was a little warm, but it was nowhere near the type of temperature that would cause any problem for electronics. So I think that my approach is working here, and I'm not going to be running it that hot most of the time anyway. I think that's sort of a empirical confirmation that there's adequate airflow there for convection to take place without it overheating the power amp or causing an issue for the preamp. If I ever determine that it is, I'll do something different. The other thing that I wanted to make sure with this is that I could operate this without it sliding around. And really, you know, you've got the power button here, so I can do that, and it doesn't budge. and I can turn the knob no problem. And I can push this and make selections. I can push it pretty forcefully, and the whole stack moves a little bit, but it's not going anywhere. So my approach of nesting the feet of the preamp into recesses in my riser, and then having the little pins, the alignment pins, going into slots in the top of the amplifier to anchor it, seems to be working out pretty well. You may wonder what this thing is while I've got it in the video. This is something I came up with because I also have a set of standard home theater speakers placed on the floor in front of the Maggies. They're down low to the ground. They don't really interfere with the Maggies at all. And because this Rotel doesn't have the ability to A/B switch speakers, it only has one speaker output. I needed a way to be able to select which speakers were being driven, so years ago I designed a pair of switch boxes that go on the floor right behind the Maggies, and the large diameter cable, it's actually honest to God monster cable, runs from the Rotel output to those two boxes, one box per channel, and then from there's relays inside those boxes, and those switch the speaker cable at that point for the last couple feet to the Maggies, or the last maybe 3 feet around to the theater speakers. And I have this little switch box stuck on the side of the Rotel where I can flick a switch. I can have green or nothing or red, and red is the theater speakers, green is the Maggies, and middle is nothing. So it's just like disconnecting the speaker wires. And the relays operate off of 12 volts. So I have this old, I think it's a Radio Shack, yeah it is, one of their kind of universal wall wart type of things, although pretty high current, more than enough to run those relays. And it's basically pulling in and holding 4 relays, whether I have Maggies or theater speakers selected. So that's what that's doing there. It's the power supply for this switch circuit, and then going out to the relay switch boxes. And it just sits here up on the corner, kind of ugly.